Everyone, welcome to a presentation, more an analysis of what day was Jesus Christ crucified. This is a study of the 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb, actually the 3 days in the tomb, but we'll see what the difference between those two expressions is as we go throughout this presentation. So let me talk about what's going to be covered in this presentation. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the deception around the confusion between Easter and Passover, and what do they mean, and how does the world celebrate what they think is to do with Christ's death and resurrection. So we'll look at Easter and Passover, although there's a separate presentation that I've done about Easter, especially Easter 2020. So it's just a kind of summary of the differences between the two. Then I'll look at a modern Bible version texts and how they confuse things. I'll spend a lot of time understanding the way in which Bible writers, Luke in particular, counts the days, and I'll do it step by step through Acts chapter 10. After that, we'll then look at the Levitical feasts, Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits in particular, to understand the significance of when Christ died, when he rose, so that we see the fulfillment of the Bible prophecies in the Old Testament feasts. Then we'll have another look at a significant and the most significant modern Bible verse that has affected our views, or the views of many, in terms of when Christ was crucified. And the very last thing we'll do is look at a Passover Calculator, which enables you to calculate what day and date in terms of month of the calendar every Passover in history occurred. And we'll look in particular at 2020 just to make sure it's right, and then we'll go back a few years, and then we'll go to the year that Christ died. Okay, let's get straight in. It's really important that we understand what a month is, because Jewish months start with a new moon. And so if we start at the 3 o'clock position, a month starts at new moon. It goes from new moon to waxing crescent, and then after the first quarter, the first week or so, you end up with a half moon. From the half moon, it goes to the waxing gibbous, whatever that means, and then halfway through the month is a full moon. So we start with no moon or a new moon. As you see, the sliver of the new moon is the beginning of the month. Halfway through the month is the full moon. Then you're having the waning gibbons, and the third quarter is also half moon, but a different part is illuminated. And then the waning crescent, and finally the new moon again. So that's the lunar cycle. So that's trying to show the different phases of the moon. A similar version here. So you start with the new moon, that's the beginning of the month. First quarter, halfway through the month is a full moon. Third quarter, and then finally a new moon back to the beginning. So that's what a month is. But it's really important. Months begin with a new moon, and halfway through is a full moon. Those are the real lessons I want us to learn from what a Jewish month is. So here's a question for you. We encounter Passover and Easter all the time. The question is, what do these have to do with Jesus? So what is Passover? Well, the Bible talks about Passover in Leviticus 23 and verse 5, I think it is. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. Leviticus 23. Easter, on the other hand, is defined by the Council of Nicaea in 325 of the current era, and they established, so Nicaea established that Easter would be held on the first day after the first full moon. So a couple of things there. The first month of the Hebrew calendar is Nisan, and the 14th day of the first month is Passover. The 15th day of Nisan is always a full moon. The Council of Nicaea, knowing that Passover was the day before the full moon, insisted that Easter could never coincide with Passover by establishing the fact that Easter would be the first Sunday after the full moon. And we'll talk about why a Sunday in a moment. But a couple of questions for you, again, to try and understand what we should, when we read the Bible and have a reference to a month. How many days are in a month? Now, in a non-leap year, 365 days divided by 12 is 30.42. In a leap year, 366 divided by 12 is 30.5. So how many days in a month? Well, the answer is not 30.42 or 30.5. It would only be those values if every year were exactly 12 months. But that, of course, is not the case. So how many days in a month? Well, the average number of days it takes for the moon to orbit the Earth, because of the elliptical nature of the moon's orbit and the differences in terms of the lunar orbit plane. So the moon orbits through the equator, but at a different angle to the elliptical orbit of the Earth around the Sun. And as a consequence, it's not exactly 29.53, it's 29.5 and various subdivisions as the Earth orbits the Sun and the Moon orbits the Earth. So 29.53 is the time it takes for the Moon to return to its same position on any part of the Earth. Now, 365 divided by 29.53 is 12.36. So 12 months and approximately a third of a month. 0.333 would be a third. So it's a little bit more than a third of a month. So approximately 12 and a third months in every year. And so what the Jews do is every 3 years approximately, they will add a 13th month just to keep a rough combination between the solar cycle, the sun orbiting the Earth, and the lunar cycle. So let's get back to the question. What do these have to do with Jesus? Passover and Easter. Well, let's look at Passover first. Passover, Leviticus 23. I need to find out the verse. The verse will appear later. I think it's verse 5. Leviticus 23, verse 4 or 5 says, "In the 14th day of the first month, at even, is the Lord's Passover." And then the following day, the next two verses, the 15th day of the month, unleavened bread, follows Passover. And because there are 14 and a half days approximately, the 15th day of the month is always a full moon. The 15th day of any month is always a full moon, since just over 29 and a half days in a month, half of that 14 and a half. So on the 15th day is always when the full moon takes place on the lunar calendar. So, what has Easter to do with Jesus? Is my next question. Well, Council of Nicaea established that Easter would be the first Sunday after the full moon. Now, they actually add a little bit to that. It's the first full moon after the vernal equinox. What's the vernal equinox? The vernal equinox is when the sun is at the same distance from the sun is right over the equator, and as a result, the length of the day is exactly the same as the length of the night. There is an autumnal equinox uh, around October time when the sun is exactly the same distance above the earth from the equator, where again the length of the light part of the day and the dark part of the day are exactly equal, and those are the two equinoxes. So it's the spring equinox and the autumnal equinox, but the spring equinox is Easter, and that leads up to the summer solstice when the sun is at its highest, and the equinoxes are to do with sun worship, as Easter is to do with sun worship. And again, I have a very long presentation about Easter, but Easter represents the conception of the sun god at the pagan festival Ishtar. 9 months after Ishtar or Easter, where we celebrate with, or where the world celebrates with eggs and bunnies representing fertility, 9 months later is the birth of the sun god at Christmas, at the winter solstice. 9 months after, 3/4 of the year later, is the winter solstice. And although people believe it's the birth of Christ, nothing to do with Christ are Easter or Christmas. But this, let's not get sidetracked. This is really about Passover and Christ's death. So before we do that, though, let's have a look at a couple of ways in which modern Bibles confuse us. So there are two accounts here. I'm not telling you which version is which yet. So the Acts chapter 12 talks about Herod killing James, the brother of John. That's the Apostle James. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. And it tells you when this took place. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And you can see on the right-hand side, he proceeded to seize Peter after he'd killed James. This is Herod. And this happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then verse 4 is different. One version says that Herod, having arrested Peter, put him in prison and was intending, according to one version, after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Another version says he was intending after the Passover to bring him to the people. Now, which version is which? Is it Easter that's right or Passover that's right? I'll get you to think about that for a moment. Which one is correct? Well, let's first of all see which version is which. So it's the King James Version that mentions Easter, and the New International Version which says Passover, like all modern versions. So is it Easter or is it Passover? Well, let's go back to Leviticus 23. It is verse 5. Leviticus 23, verse 5. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. Verse 6. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So clearly, Passover comes before unleavened bread. Passover, the 14th day of the month, is definitely before the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. So let's get back here. If unleavened bread, the 15th day of the month, it cannot possibly be that Herod is waiting until Passover, to bring Peter out to prison for the public trial, because the 15th, it would be 364 days later that Peter would come out of prison, since the 14th day Passover comes before the 15th day unleavened bread. So the New International Version, I'm afraid, is wrong. It's the nigh impossible version in this particular case, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread does not come before Passover in a particular year. So the King James Version is absolutely right. Then were the days of unleavened bread, because Easter is the first Sunday after the full moon, then it cannot be the same day as Passover. Cannot possibly ever be the same day as Passover. Easter is a Sunday. Easter Sunday is always after the full moon. Passover, the day before the full moon. King James is right. Modern versions are trying to say, oh, it shouldn't be Easter, it should be Passover. But no, that's wrong. So let me just summarize. Easter is almost always the first Sunday after Passover. I say almost always because once in, let's call it a blue moon, because Easter can be late, they will have the Passover. They will have Easter before Passover, but it's exceptionally rare. Okay, let's get to our main point though, and we'll see why Easter comes in a little bit later. But we're now going to start seeing how Bible writers count the days, and we're going to do that by looking at Acts chapter 10, written by Luke, where Cornelius sends for Peter to come from Joppa to Caesarea. And because the Bible describes the entire process and the number of days and each day of that process, it will help us to understand how days were counted in the Bible. So let's jump to Acts chapter 10. So there's a little map. I, in 2004, went from Joppa to Caesarea. Joppa was very close to Tel Aviv, and it took half an hour driving. But in those days, they would have been walking or perhaps taking a horse or a donkey, but it's a long way to walk. So, Acts chapter 10, verse 3, Cornelius saw in a vision about the 9th hour of the day an angel of God coming in to him and saying unto him, Cornelius. So, although the Bible doesn't say which day of the week these events occur, just to keep things simple, I'm starting with the first day of the week, Sunday. And so the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m., Cornelius receives a vision. So that's establishing when we start. And as we go throughout chapter 10, we're going to see what happens on the morrow and the morrow after are the expressions that are used. So, on the morrow, so the next day, as they went on their journey and drew nigh unto the city, so Cornelius sends a group of men to go and call Peter. So on the morrow, they went on their journey and drew nigh unto the city. Peter went up on the housetop to pray the 6th hour. So it happens that they walk most of the night, and well, maybe they rested a bit at night, but and walked and arrived at noon at Peter's house. So Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. So Peter's praying about the 6th hour. That's Acts chapter 10, verse 9. Okay, so I'm going to keep each Bible verse reference and the day on the screen so you can see what's going on. They're journeying from Caesarea to Joppa. They've just arrived at Joppa, where Peter is. So Peter calls them in, lodged them, and on the morrow, Peter went away with them, and certain brethren from Joppa accompanied him. So Cornelius prays. The next day, he sends some friends to see Peter, and then verse 23, and on the morrow, Peter joins these men, and they must have been quite fit to walk a whole day from Caesarea to Joppa, and they now start to walk back to Caesarea. Okay. Verse 24, and on the morrow after. So the day after, they entered into Caesarea, and Cornelius waited for them and had called together his kinsmen and his near friends. So Cornelius in Caesarea will have known it's going to take a day to walk back. So a day to walk there. Peter keeps them overnight, gives them a day's rest, and then they walk back. Now, we would call that 1, 2, 3 days. And so day 3, they arrive at Caesarea. And that's Acts 10, verse 24. So how many days have elapsed? Is it 3 or is it 4? Let's just look at it again. Cornelius sends the guys to Joppa 1 day. Peter keeps them overnight, 2 days. Then Peter joins them and they set off for Caesarea 3 days. So that's 3 days, isn't it? It's not 4. So let's have a look and see in verse 30 what Cornelius says. Cornelius said after they entered the house, 4 days ago I was fasting until this hour. So 4 days ago, at the 9th hour, Cornelius is fasting until the 9th hour. So it's almost exactly 3 days ago. 4 days ago, I was fasting until this hour. So it was the 9th hour 4 days ago, what we would call 3 days. 9th hour, the day that Cornelius is speaking to Peter, Peter's friends and Cornelius's servants. 3 days we would call that. But Cornelius says, 4 days ago I was fasting until this hour. And at the 9th hour I prayed in my house, and behold, an angel stood before me in bright clothing. So let's just dwell on that a moment. We would say 3 days, but Cornelius is clearly referring to day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Parts of 4 days. Not 96 hours, which is 4 times 24, but just over 72 hours. 3 times 24 is 72. So it's just over 3 days. But Cornelius is referring to those as 4 days. We must understand what Cornelius is referring to and recognize that what we say are 3 days, Cornelius is describing as 4 days. And whenever we see Bible writers refer to the part of a day, they call that 1 day. So what we call yesterday, Cornelius would have said 2 days ago. Any part of a day is a day. Now let's change these day 1, day 2, day 3. We don't know what days they actually were, but let's change them to Thursday, Friday, Sabbath, Sunday. Since there is a belief that the crucifixion took place on a Thursday, if it were Thursday, now we know it's not Thursday because they wouldn't be walking on the Sabbath. So it's 4 days on the Sunday, 4 days ago on the Sunday, if the fasting that Cornelius started was the 9th hour on Thursday. Sunday would be the 4th day. Can anyone not understand that that's the case? Thursday to Sunday is the 4th day in biblical terms. So if it's a Thursday crucifixion, all references to Sunday should say the 4th day. The 4th day if it's a Thursday crucifixion. So 4 days means parts of 4 days, no matter how small the parts. We would call this 3 days or 72 hours. 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb must therefore either be an expression representing part of 3 days, or the Bible contradicts itself. And we're going to go a little bit more detail into that later. But let's examine Luke's account of the crucifixion. Since it's Luke who wrote Acts chapter 10, let's see what Luke describes as the crucifixion. Luke 23:54, and that day was the preparation and the Sabbath drew on. The preparation, the day before the Sabbath, is when the crucifixion took place. So the 6th hour was when Christ was crucified. We would call that noon, 12 noon. And then Luke 23:44 says it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole earth until the 9th hour, 3 p.m. And in verse 54, after Christ died at 3 p.m., that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath was drawing on. And I'm looking here at sunset, which is the end of the day, again in biblical terms. In Luke chapter 24, verse 1, just a couple of verses later, upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. So, resurrection morning, first day of the week, very early in the morning, Luke 24, verse 1, we see that the resurrection is taking place. And so, we know there's a crucifixion, we know there's a resurrection. I've just got here a single day, but clearly, because some people believe he was crucified and he spent 3 actual days in the tomb and 3 nights in the tomb, there could be more days. But let's see. Luke 24:21. On the way to Emmaus, 2 disciples had met Jesus, and they asked him, where have you been? Have you not heard what has happened? And they say, we trusted that it had been he, Christ, which should have redeemed Israel. And beside all this, today, this is Sunday, Luke 24:21. It's the same day as the resurrection. Resurrection took place in the morning. On the way to Emmaus, they say, today is the 3rd day since these things were done. If today's the 3rd day, not only was resurrection the 3rd day, but even when it's near sunset, in verse 29, we'll see that it's still the 3rd day. The whole day is the 3rd day. The whole day started sunset Sabbath. The 3rd day started sunset Sabbath and finished sunset Sunday. So if today near sunset is the 3rd day, then we've just seen from the Cornelius account and Luke's description, and of course it's Luke who's describing this journey to Emmaus and quoting the disciples, then 3 days is parts of 3 days. 1, 2, 3. Entirely consistent with what we saw in Acts chapter 10 and how we understand the days from not just the Greek perspective of Cornelius, but the Jewish perspective. So that day was the preparation day, preparation of the Sabbath. Christ rested in the tomb on the Sabbath, and then Sunday morning, first day of the week, very early in the morning, he rose from the dead. Praise the Lord. So let's just continue a little bit more. It is the 3rd day, the whole day, Sunday. And Luke 24:13, I'm sure, is what the angels okay, I'm not sure why I've got 24:13 there. Let's change that to 21. Yeah, it's supposed to be 21. So if today's the 3rd day, well, all these things started at the crucifixion, noon on Friday. And so that's 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. And today, nearing sunset, is the third day, entirely consistent. So preparation day, is day 1, Sabbath day 2, first day, day 3. And in verse 29, Luke 24:29, they constrain him, saying, "Abide with us." This is the disciples. They came into the house and they've been walking with this stranger. For some reason, they didn't recognize that it was Christ. It's toward evening, the day's far spent, and he went in. Christ tarried with them. And when they saw him break bread, they recognized that it was indeed Christ. So the 3 days, even Sunday evening near sunset, is still the third day. The day's far spent. The whole day started sunset Saturday, finished sunset Sunday. So when we talk about that third day, the third day is the day on which the resurrection took place and lasted not just from the time of the resurrection, but until sunset. That's when days are measured. Although the counter is not necessarily beginning at sunset, any part of a day is counted as a day, but days begin sunset and end at sunset. So Luke is consistent. In Acts 10, he describes what we call 3 days. Cornelius describes as 4 days. Luke 24, the first day of the week, is described as the third day since the crucifixion. We would call this 2 days, or approximately 48 hours. And that's why many people are uncomfortable with the Friday crucifixion, Sunday resurrection. It's only, it's less than 48 hours. So let's just finish this off and understand what the feasts concerning Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits, and how they were fulfilled by Christ precisely. So let's start with Passover. Now, there's a verse in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, which says that Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. I've highlighted for us there because the modern versions miss out for us. Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. And this for us, this death of Christ, isn't just for us, it's exactly at the time when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed in the temple. You see, every day in the temple there was a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice. On the day of the Passover, not only was there the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice, there was also a Passover sacrifice. So you had the morning sacrifice at the 3rd hour, the evening sacrifice at the 9th hour, and the Passover sacrifice at the 6th hour. In our terms, that's 9, 12, and 3. So Thursday night, on the day of the Passover, at sunset, they killed the lamb because that was commemorating their deliverance from Egypt. And because they left their homes in Egypt after the lamb was slain and the angel of death killed the firstborn, they started to walk and leave Egypt on the Passover. Now, the lamb burnt here is the lamb being sacrificed. So although the lamb is killed and eaten Thursday evening, commemorated by the Last Supper, the sacrifice took place in the day, the daytime following. So sunset Thursday, the lamb's killed. Friday at noon, the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the temple. And I've got some verses there for you to check those out. Now, we saw earlier that the day after Passover is unleavened bread. And unleavened bread is a 7-day feast that was to be a rest day. They were to do no work on that day. And so the 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 Sabbath day that year was coinciding with the first day of unleavened bread. And that unleavened bread is also the day of the full moon. And then if we go to Leviticus and Leviticus 23 verse 11, it says, during that 7-day feast of unleavened bread, whichever day follows the Sabbath, the day after the Sabbath, Leviticus 23 verse 11, is always going to be the first day of the week. So the day after the Sabbath is when first fruits is. So Leviticus 23 verse 11, the morrow after Sabbath is the first fruits. That will always be the Sunday, the first day of the week, for first fruits. Now, is that not a prophecy of when Christ would be raised from the dead as the firstborn or the first fruits of the dead? I say it is. So the day after the Sabbath, Sunday, is the day of first fruits, the commemoration of the resurrection of Christ. But before it took place, it was in effect a prophecy of when Christ would be raised from the dead. So 1 Corinthians 15 verse 20, but now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. So Christ rose from the dead on the first day, the day after the Sabbath, the morrow after the Sabbath, and has become the first fruits of them that slept. So we can see that the Old Testament sacrifices and feasts were prefiguring the exact time of Christ's death and the exact day of his resurrection on first fruits. And that's when we would celebrate the resurrection. The problem is the Catholic Church has decided first fruits is now the most important day of the week. That first day of the week is the day that Christians should remember Christ's resurrection. But let's go back to our understanding of the third day. So in Luke 24 verse 6 and 7, when the disciples visited the tomb, the angel said, he's not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. Now, the angels aren't speaking one language and the disciples a different language. If the disciples understand that the whole day from sunset Saturday to sunset Sunday is the third day, then that's the day that Christ will be raised from the dead. The angels aren't going to be speaking one language and the disciples understand something different. So there is no doubt that the angels are saying the third day Christ would be raised again. And that is, of course, the first day of the week, the day after the Sabbath. And that's Luke 24, 6 and 7. Now, I'm going to depart a little. In fact, what I'll do is I'll take a break here. And then I'll come back for part 2.